So, welcome to the TRT and Hormone Optimization YouTube channel. Back with us is Gil T. Welcome, Gil.
Hey, thank you, Stephen.
Hi, Gil. So, we got a question or a bunch of questions from one viewer all about iron and ferritin. I will just read those questions out loud. He says, I think we need another video explaining how testosterone affects iron levels and more on what to do if ferritin is low but not anemic and other iron markers are normal. Seems like a lot of people are having this sort of problem. Thanks. And can low ferritin cause issues if you are not anemic? Go ahead, Gil.
So it's interesting. I actually read two studies just this past week. One of them was with Dr. Lipschultz out of Texas, and the other one was out of Taiwan from 2015. And what they found was an inverse relationship between testosterone and ferritin levels. So first, it's important to understand what ferritin is. Ferritin is essentially sort of a holding or storage tank for iron stores in the body. When the cells detect that the iron levels are too high, they can either excrete or store your iron for future use. So ferritin is sort of like your savings account for your iron. In the Lipschultz study, there's a direct inverse correlation between elevated ferritin and low testosterone. And when I dug a little deeper into that study, it seemed to have a gonadotropic effect. So it showed that the higher the iron levels in a male, the lower the correlating luteinizing hormone level was, and therefore the lower the endogenous testosterone production was. So indirectly, men who had elevated iron had lower testosterone levels. So this could bring up an interesting point for we know iron toxicity and whatnot. You got to be cautious with over supplementing iron, which is why a lot of the multivitamins actually say iron free, because oftentimes you want to be able to supplement that separately if needed or avoid it if you don't need it. But if you elevate your iron in addition to the other array of things that are notorious for high iron toxicity, you also need to consider if you're a naturally producing male for your sex hormones, your luteinizing hormone level has been shown to be decreased in that one study. In the Taiwan study, they actually showed that the higher the testosterone level, the lower the ferritin level. Now, this is an interesting point that I've looked at for quite a while, and I think this brings us more to the point of this question. Remember, testosterone, we know, has several mechanisms by which it induces erythropoiesis, or the production of erythrocytes or red blood cells. One is there's been suggestions that it increases the activity of erythropoietin, which is short for EPO, which is released by the kidneys, and that stimulates bone marrow to produce red blood cells. And the other one is more of a unknown sort of effect, which constitutes, in some studies I've looked at, up to about 10% of erythrocyte production, is testosterone actually having a direct effect on an increase in erythrocytes. And no one can really pinpoint the mechanism by which this happens, but this is secondary to erythropoietin. So if you consider both of them essentially having the same end result, which is an elevation in RBCs and presumably in hemoglobin, which we know anecdotally to be true based on men on testosterone having higher levels than A, they previously did, or B, their counterparts who are not treated, it is only common sense to assume that your ferritin levels will decline on testosterone because you're now utilizing more of that iron. So when you're uptaking more iron to make hemoglobin, because hemoglobin is essentially a protein that carries oxygen and carbon dioxide out of your oxygen into your cells, carbon dioxide out. Hemoglobin is basically heme and globin. It's a protein made out of heme, which is iron. So you need iron to make hemoglobin. The more hemoglobin you have, the more iron you're utilizing, and therefore the less storage of iron you'll have. So naturally, as we spend more, our savings account is depleted. As we produce more hemoglobin, our ferritin, aka iron savings account, is depleted. So it is normal and actually an expected finding to see a decrease in ferritin or serum ferritin levels in men with elevated exogenous testosterone. Because remember, endogenous testosterone, going back to the Lipschultz study, is generally decreased due to a drop in LH or gonadotropic activity, and therefore it may be suppressing or balancing out with that ferritin level at some degree. But when you exogenously administer testosterone, you're bypassing the need for LH, you're bypassing that natural suppression that occurs from elevated iron levels, and you're continuing to deplete your ferritin stores by producing more hemoglobin. Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing? The answer is we're not quite sure, but there's two schools of thought here. We always say if your ferritin is depleted, you're going to potentially suffer anemia or potentially feel fatigued. This holds true under the first situation of a naturally producing male, because without ferritin level, you don't have sufficient iron to produce sufficient hemoglobin. You may become hypoxic, anemic, etc. But if the reason for your low ferritin is because you are utilizing that iron sufficiently, now begs the question, is the ferritin really as essential as it was in the individual who was low for reasons of malnourishment or genetic activity or some other sort of deficiency, whereas now it's actually low because you're actually utilizing it for its intended purpose. So I would venture to say here and tell guys, if you're on TRT and your ferritin is not critically low, but it is lower than quote unquote normal, that is a normal expected finding because you are utilizing it properly. If you're not on testosterone therapy and your ferritin levels are declining, now you're going to run into a potential risk of anemia, fatigue, et cetera, et cetera. So those are two completely different paths, and it's important to understand the difference.
But since you're using this iron more rapidly, isn't there a constant need to take extra iron to produce those hemoglobin?
No, because when you're utilizing it more rapidly, you run a greater risk of iron toxicity because it is being taken up that much more efficiently. So if you're not anemic, right? If you're not anemic, the primary, I mean, iron has many benefits and reactions in the body, but the primary focus here for anemia is to prevent hemoglobin and RBCs from dropping. So again, if you're not critically low on your ferritin and your H&H look good and your RBCs look good and overall your hematology looks good, there is really no deficiency to try to fix. So just by overloading it for the sake of getting the storage levels up, as long as you're consuming a well-balanced nutritional diet, I would not necessarily recommend supplementing with additional iron just for the mere fact of elevating ferritin on its own. That in and of itself. Now, again, if you're relatively on the lower side of the scale on your hemoglobin RBCs and you're lower on the ferritin side and you're not on testosterone, that is a concern that may be requiring you to supplement iron to prevent anemia. But again, this is not something that I would really worry too much about for men on testosterone if they're not critically low. It's okay to be slightly below range. In fact, it's expected. It's expected. So.
Okay, that's clear.
Consider becoming a channel member for exclusive features, like loyalty badges, early access to new videos, funny stuff like rough cuts and bloopers, members-only photos and status updates on the community tab, and members-only livestream chat. On desktop, use the join button next to the subscribe. On mobile, use the join link in the description.